In 1963, two teams of archaeologists, from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul, walked across a low hill in southeastern Turkey. They saw some broken slabs of limestone poking out of the ground. They decided it was probably an abandoned medieval cemetery. And they moved on. For the next 30 years, a farmer plowed the top of that hill. Every season, his blade caught on the same buried stones. He cleared them, and kept working. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt read the old survey notes from 1963, and something about them made him drive out to see the hill for himself. What the others had called gravestones, Schmidt recognized as something else. They were the tops of enormous carved pillars, and they were still mostly underground. When his team began to dig, they found rings of standing stones, shaped like the letter T, some of them over 5 meters tall. And when they sent samples to be dated, the answer came back almost impossible to believe. The stones had been raised around 9,600 years before the Common Era. 11,500 years ago. 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid. 6,000 years before Stonehenge. This is Göbekli Tepe, the oldest temple on Earth. And it was built by people who, by every rule we thought we knew, should not have been able to build it at all. To understand why this hill rewrote history, you have to understand who was alive when it was built. The site sits on a ridge above the plains near the city of Urfa, in southeastern Turkey, on the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. In Turkish, the place is called Göbekli Tepe. It means, roughly, Potbelly Hill. And for most of modern history, that is all it was. A rounded hill on a wide plateau, with a few stones in the dirt. The 1963 survey noted the stones, but it found no temple, no city, no obvious reason to dig. So the hill was left alone for half a century. When Klaus Schmidt finally stood on it in 1994, he later said he had two choices: turn around and leave, or stay for the rest of his life. He stayed. He would dig at Göbekli Tepe until the day he died, 20 years later. What he uncovered was not a building in the way we think of buildings. It was a series of great circular enclosures, dug into the hillside. Each one was a ring of T-shaped limestone pillars, standing upright, linked by low stone walls. And at the center of each ring stood two more pillars, larger than the rest, facing each other. The radiocarbon dates place the oldest of these rings at around 9,600 BC. To put that in perspective, the pyramids of Egypt are about 4,500 years old. Göbekli Tepe is more than 11,000. When these stones were raised, there was no writing anywhere on Earth. There were no cities, no metal, no pottery, no wheel. There were no farms. The people who built this did not plant crops, and they did not keep herds. They were hunter-gatherers. They lived by following wild animals and gathering wild plants, the way humans had done for tens of thousands of years. And everything we thought we knew said that people like that could not build something like this. Monuments were supposed to come much later. After farming. After villages. After kings. Göbekli Tepe was none of that. And it was already ancient before the first farmer ever planted the first field. So look closely at what they actually made. The pillars are cut from limestone. The largest stand 5.5 meters tall and weigh as much as 10 tons each. They were quarried from the bedrock nearby, shaped, moved across the hill, and raised upright into prepared sockets. Remember the toolkit available. No metal chisels. No iron. No bronze. Only tools of stone, bone, and wood. No wheels to roll the pillars. No horses or oxen to pull them. Just human muscle, rope, and an enormous amount of coordinated effort. In the quarry beside the site, one unfinished pillar still lies in the rock, around 7 meters long, never separated from the bedrock. To raise even one of these stones would have taken hundreds of people, working together, for a long time. And that, on its own, is a kind of revolution. Hundreds of hunter-gatherers, organized, fed, and directed toward a single shared project. But it is the carvings that make Göbekli Tepe unforgettable. The pillars are covered in animals, carved in relief, rising out of the stone. Foxes, snakes, wild boars, cranes, scorpions, vultures, aurochs, the giant wild cattle that no longer exist. These are not crude scratches. They are confident, detailed, deliberate, the work of artists who had clearly done this many times before. Some animals seem chosen for fear, Snakes coil down the pillars. A scorpion raises its tail. Vultures spread their wings. And then there are the central pillars. Look at them carefully, and you realize they are not just abstract shapes. Carved along their sides are arms. They bend at the elbow. They end in long-fingered hands that meet at the front of the stone. There are belts carved at the waist, and what looks like a loincloth hanging below. The T-shaped pillars are not just stones. They are figures. Towering, faceless, human-shaped beings, standing in a ring, facing each other. Whether they are gods, ancestors, spirits, or the dead, no one knows. But they are clearly meant to be someone. And there are far more of them than we have uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped the hill beneath the surface. It shows that the 4 excavated enclosures are only the beginning. There may be around 20 of these great rings buried in the hill. After decades of digging, archaeologists estimate they have uncovered only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe. Now, here is why all of this was so hard to accept. For most of the 20th century, we told a very clear story about how civilization began. We called it the Neolithic Revolution. The story went like this. First, people learned to farm. Farming produced extra food. Extra food let people settle in one place. Settlement grew into villages, then towns. Eventually, some people had enough surplus that they did not need to farm at all. They became priests, and rulers, and builders. And only then, at the very end of that chain, did humans build temples and monuments to their gods. In other words, first the full belly, then the cathedral. Bread came before worship. Göbekli Tepe turns that story on its head. Here, the monument comes first. The great carved rings were raised by people who had not yet learned to farm. The temple is older than the village. Older than the field. Older than bread. This led Klaus Schmidt to a radical idea. What if we had the whole story backwards? What if it was not farming that made the temple possible, but the temple that made farming necessary? Think about what it takes to gather hundreds of people on a hill, season after season, to quarry and carve and raise these stones. You have to feed them. All of them. In one place. 4 weeks at a time. And there is a clue in the ground. The site is full of grinding stones and the bones of wild animals, and signs of enormous feasts. The very region around Göbekli Tepe is where one of the world's first wild wheats was later domesticated. So perhaps the order really was reversed. Perhaps the need to feed the builders, and the feasts, pushed people to tame the wild grasses growing on the hills around them. Perhaps it was not hunger that built the first farms. Perhaps it was the gods. The desire to gather, and to build something larger than any single life, that may have been the thing that changed us forever. The people of Göbekli Tepe used the site for around 1,500 years. They built new rings. They modified old ones. Sometimes they took a ring apart and raised a smaller one inside it. And then, around 8,000 years before the Common Era, something strange happened. The enclosures were filled in, packed with rubble, broken tools, animal bones, and earth, until the great pillars were buried up to their shoulders and beyond. For a long time, archaeologists read this as a deliberate act. The people did not just abandon their temple. They buried it. On purpose. If that is true, it is an extraordinary thing to imagine. A community choosing to take the holiest place they had ever made, and bury it with their own hands. Was it the end of a belief? A way of closing one world before opening another? A farewell? We do not know. And in fact, even this is now debated. Some researchers think the filling built up more gradually, through erosion and reuse, rather than in one great act of burial. But whatever happened, the effect was the same. The earth that covered the pillars also protected them. It sealed the carvings away from rain, and frost, and time. The fox stayed sharp on the stone. The vulture kept its wings. The hands of the great central figures stayed folded across the rock. And the whole place vanished beneath a hill, with no name, no memory, no one left who knew what it was. For 11,500 years, the oldest temple on earth waited in the dark, forgotten longer than anything humans have ever built. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014. But the digging did not stop. And the story is still changing. Because Göbekli Tepe, it turns out, was not alone. Across the plains around Urfa, archaeologists have now found a whole family of sites from the same deep age. They call the project Tepeler, the Stone Hills. The most stunning is a site called Karahan, a short drive away. There, more than 250 pillars have been found, along with a 2-meter statue of a man, and a chamber cut straight into the bedrock, lined with stone pillars and watched over by a human head emerging from the wall. And as these sites are studied, the original picture is being rewritten. At Göbekli Tepe itself, archaeologists have now found traces of houses, and signs that wild grain was being processed here on a large scale. This may not have been a lonely temple that nomads visited and left. It may have been something closer to a town, one of the very first places on Earth where people lived together all year round. A place where the sacred and the everyday were tangled together from the very beginning. And here is the strange, humbling truth at the heart of it. We have found the oldest monument human beings ever raised. We can stand inside it. We can measure it and date it and touch its stones. And we still cannot say, for certain, what it was for. 11,500 years ago, on a hill in the dawn of everything, someone carved a fox, and a vulture, and a pair of human hands into solid rock. Then they covered it over, and walked away, and were forgotten so completely that we did not even know to look for them. The animals are still there, frozen mid-motion on the pillars, staring out across a world that has changed beyond anything they could have imagined. We will never hear their language. We will never learn their names, or their gods, or the words they spoke on that hill. They left us the oldest question we will ever ask, carved in the oldest stone we will ever find, and no way at all to answer it. In the next video, we travel back to Asia, to the delta of the Mekong, where an empire you have probably never heard of traded with Rome and India and China, built canals you can still see from space, and then disappeared so thoroughly that we argue about its name to this day. That's the story of Funan. Subscribe so you don't miss it.